The screams of Vivian Parker echoed through the barn, but nobody within 100 yards would hear her. Her cruel cousins had made sure of that. The year was 1875, and in this remote corner of Wyoming territory, justice was whatever the strongest family in the county said it was. For 3 days, she had been chained to a wooden post, her wrists raw and bleeding from the rusty shackles that bit into her skin every time she moved. Rain pattered against the weathered roof, leaking through in places to form muddy puddles on the dirt floor. The smell of wet hay and horse manure filled her nostrils as she slumped against the post. Her throat was parched, her lips cracked from dehydration. They had given her just enough water to keep her alive. Punishment, they said, for trying to claim what was rightfully hers. "Your pa left this land to all of us," her cousin Jeb had snarled when they caught her with the deed papers. "Not just to some fancy educated girl who thinks she can waltz back from Boston and take what belongs to the whole Parker clan." Vivian's crime had been simple: returning home after her father's death to claim her inheritance, the small but profitable cattle ranch that had been in her family for 2 generations. But the Parker cousins who had moved in after her father's passing had other ideas. The barn door creaked open, allowing a sliver of gray dawn light to penetrate the gloom. Vivian tensed, expecting to see Jeb or one of her other cousins come to taunt her. Instead, a tall figure she didn't recognize stood silhouetted in the doorway. "Hello," the stranger's voice was deep, cautious. "Is someone in here?" Vivian tried to call out, but her parched throat produced only a hoarse whisper. The stranger stepped further into the barn, and as her eyes adjusted, she could make out the shape of a man in a long duster coat, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. "Dear God," he muttered as he spotted her. In 3 long strides, he was kneeling beside her, his face now visible in the dim light. Strong jaw, concerned blue eyes, and a 3-day stubble that spoke of long days on the trail. "Who did this to you?" he asked, examining the chains with growing anger. "My cousins," Vivian managed to whisper. "The Parkers." "I'm going to get you out of here," he said, standing to look around the barn. "Name's Roy Thornton, just passing through on my way to Cheyenne when I heard shouting from the main house. Thought I'd better check the property." He found a rusty set of tools hanging on the wall and returned with a pair of heavy bolt cutters. "This might hurt," he warned, positioning the cutters around the chain near her wrists. "Try not to move." With a grunt of effort, he snapped the chain. The relief was immediate, though her wrists remained encircled by the iron cuffs. "Can you stand?" he asked, offering his hand. Vivian tried, but her legs buckled beneath her after days of sitting on the hard, packed earth. Without hesitation, Roy scooped her into his arms. She was slight in his strong grip, weakened by her ordeal. "They'll be back soon," she warned, her voice still barely audible. "Let them come," Roy said grimly, adjusting his hold on her. "I've dealt with worse than backwoods tyrants." He carried her to the barn door and paused, listening for any sounds from the main house about 100 yards away. Hearing nothing, he stepped out into the morning light. The cool air and soft sunlight breaking through the clouds felt like heaven on Vivian's skin after days in the dank barn. "My horse is hidden in the trees," Roy explained, nodding toward a copse about 50 yards away. "We'll get you somewhere safe, then figure out what to do about those cousins of yours." As they moved across the open yard, a shout came from the direction of the house. "Hey. What do you think you're doing?" Roy turned to see a burly man with a scraggly beard running toward them, rifle in hand. 2 more men emerged from the house behind him. "That's Jeb," Vivian whispered fearfully. "The oldest cousin." "Hold it right there," Jeb shouted, raising his rifle. "That's family business you're interfering with, stranger." Roy didn't break stride. "Any man who chains a woman in a barn has no right to speak of family," he called back, his voice steady but loud enough to carry. "I'll put a bullet in you if you take another step." Jeb threatened, stopping about 30 yards away and taking aim. Roy gently set Vivian on her feet, keeping one arm around her waist to support her. With his free hand, he pushed back his duster to reveal a holstered Colt revolver. "I wouldn't," he said calmly. "I'm taking this lady with me, and if you try to stop me, you'll regret it." Jeb hesitated, assessing the stranger. Roy Thornton stood tall and confident, the morning sun highlighting the determined set of his jaw and the steady hand hovering near his weapon. Something in his stance, the easy readiness, the unwavering gaze made Jeb lower his rifle slightly. "You don't know what you're getting into, mister," Jeb called. "This ain't your fight." "It became my fight when I found a woman chained like an animal," Roy replied evenly. "Now we're going to walk away and you're going to let us, unless you want the sheriff to hear about this." At the mention of the sheriff, Jeb's companions exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a younger man with the same Parker features as Vivian, tugged at Jeb's arm. "Maybe we should let her go, Jeb," he said quietly. "This is getting out of hand." Jeb shrugged him off angrily but didn't raise the rifle again. "This ain't over," he spat. "That land is Parker land. It belongs to those who worked it alongside Uncle Henry, not some city girl who ain't lifted a finger here in years." Roy felt Vivian stiffen beside him, but kept moving steadily toward the trees where his horse waited. He didn't turn his back on the Parkers until they were well into the cover of the pines. A magnificent chestnut gelding was tethered to a low branch, saddlebags bulging with supplies. Roy helped Vivian up onto the saddle before mounting behind her. She was so weak she leaned back against his chest, her head resting just beneath his chin. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said, noting how pale she was. "There's a town about 10 miles from here, Sweetwater," she murmured. "They know me there. My father traded with them for years." Roy nodded and urged the horse forward, keeping to the tree line as long as possible before breaking into open country. As they rode, Vivian drifted in and out of consciousness, the motion of the horse and the warmth of the man behind her lulling her into an exhausted sleep. The town of Sweetwater appeared on the horizon just as the sun reached its zenith. A small but tidy collection of wooden buildings straddling the main road, with a church steeple rising above the rest. Roy guided his horse directly to the doctor's office, marked by a simple painted sign. The doctor, a balding man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, took one look at Vivian and ushered them inside. "Good Lord, what happened to the Parker girl?" he asked as Roy laid her gently on an examination table. "Her cousins," Roy explained tersely. "Found her chained in a barn." The doctor's expression darkened as he examined Vivian's wrists. "I always thought those boys were trouble, especially after Henry died," he muttered. "Miss Parker came back about a week ago to settle her father's affairs. Word is she's the rightful heir to the ranch." "That explains why they were so keen on keeping her locked up," Roy said, watching as the doctor cleaned Vivian's wounds. "They want the ranch for themselves." "Henry Parker was a good man," the doctor said, shaking his head. "He'd be horrified to see how his nephews are treating his daughter." He looked up at Roy. "You a friend of the family?" "Just passing through," Roy replied. "Heard shouting, went to investigate, couldn't leave her there." The doctor nodded approvingly. "Well, Mr. Thornton, Roy Thornton. Well, Mr. Thornton, it's a good thing you came along when you did. Another day or two like this, and she might not have made it. Dehydration, exposure, those wounds getting infected." He trailed off, focusing on wrapping clean bandages around Vivian's wrists. "She needs rest, food, and water, and those cousins need a visit from the sheriff." "Is the sheriff in town?" Roy asked. "Left for the county seat yesterday. Won't be back for at least 3 days." The doctor frowned. "Those Parker boys know that, which is probably why they felt bold enough to do this now." Roy's jaw tightened. "Then I'll have to make sure they don't try again before he gets back." The doctor glanced up, studying the tall cowboy. "You planning to stay around that long? Thought you said you were just passing through." Roy looked at Vivian's pale face, peaceful now in sleep. Something about her courage, the dignity she maintained even in such a desperate situation, had touched him. "I reckon Cheyenne can wait a few days," he said quietly. "She can stay here tonight," the doctor offered. "My wife can look in on her, but after that she'll need somewhere safe." "Those boys won't give up easily if there's land at stake." "I'll figure something out," Roy promised. The next morning, Vivian woke to sunlight streaming through a small window. For a moment, she panicked, thinking she was still in the barn, but the clean sheets and the absence of chains quickly reassured her. Slowly, the events of the previous day came back to her, the stranger, Roy Thornton, carrying her out of captivity and into the light. The door opened and a woman in her 40s entered with a tray. "Ah, you're awake. I'm Mrs. Campbell, the doctor's wife. How are you feeling, dear?" "Better," Vivian replied, her voice stronger than it had been. "Thank you for your kindness." "It's nothing, Mrs. Campbell said, setting the tray of food beside the bed. "That cowboy who brought you in, he's been asking after you all morning. Quite concerned, he is." Vivian felt a warmth that had nothing to do with her recovering strength. "Is he still here?" "Just went to the general store." "Said he needed supplies." Mrs. Campbell helped Vivian sit up. "You should eat while it's hot. You need your strength." Vivian had just finished the simple but nourishing meal of oatmeal and toast when the door opened again and Roy entered, hat in hand. His face brightened visibly when he saw her sitting up. "Miss Parker," he said, nodding respectfully. "Good to see you looking better. Please call me Vivian," she replied. "And thank you, Mr. Thornton. I owe you my life, Roy," he corrected with a small smile, "and you don't owe me anything." Any decent man would have done the same. Mrs. Campbell looked between them with a knowing smile. "I'll leave you two to talk," she said, collecting the empty tray and slipping out. Roy moved closer to the bed, still holding his hat, turning it absently in his hands. "Doctor says you can leave today if you're feeling up to it, but we need to figure out where you'll be safe. Your cousins aren't likely to give up." Vivian's face fell. "I don't have anywhere else to go. I sold my boarding house room in Boston to come back here. The ranch is all I have left." "What about friends in town?" She shook her head. "I've been gone for 5 years. I was sent east for schooling after my mother died. I know people here, but not well enough to impose, especially with my cousins likely to cause trouble." Roy was quiet for a moment, considering. "There's a widow who owns the boarding house at the edge of town, Mrs. Sullivan. I spoke with her this morning. She has a room available and says she's not afraid of the Parker boys. Her late husband was the previous sheriff, and she still has plenty of friends in town." Vivian nodded slowly. "That sounds like a good solution, at least temporarily." She looked up at him with clear blue eyes that caught the morning light. "What about you? You mentioned you were heading to Cheyenne." Roy shifted his weight, suddenly looking almost shy, an expression that seemed at odds with his otherwise confident demeanor. "I thought I might stay around a few days, at least until the sheriff gets back. Make sure those cousins of yours don't try anything else. You do that for a stranger?" Vivian asked softly. He met her gaze steadily. "You're not exactly a stranger anymore, Miss Parker, Vivian, and I don't like leaving things unfinished." Later that day, Roy helped Vivian settle into the boarding house, a tidy 2-story building with a wide front porch and window boxes full of hardy prairie flowers. Mrs. Sullivan, a robust woman in her 50s with streaks of gray in her dark hair, welcomed them warmly. "Any enemy of those Parker boys is a friend of mine," she declared, showing Vivian to a comfortable room on the 2nd floor. "My Jacob always said they'd come to no good, just like their father before them. No offense to your father," she added quickly to Vivian. "Henry was the only decent one in that bunch." "No offense taken," Vivian assured her. "I'm beginning to realize there's a lot about my father's family I didn't know." After Mrs. Sullivan left them to get settled, Roy lingered awkwardly by the door. "I took a room down the hall," he explained. "Thought it best to stay close, just in case." Vivian smiled gratefully. "Thank you. I feel safer knowing you're nearby." She hesitated, then added, "I don't know anything about you, Roy Thornton. Where are you from? What takes you to Cheyenne?" Roy leaned against the doorframe, his tall frame filling the space. "Not much to tell. Born in Missouri, been drifting since the war, worked cattle drives, did some scouting for the Army, tried my hand at prospecting for a spell." He shrugged. "Heading to Cheyenne to meet an old Army friend who has a job offer foreman on a big spread south of there." "You fought in the war?" Vivian asked, noticing for the first time a certain guardedness in his eyes that spoke of hard experiences. "Union cavalry," he said simply. "It was a long time ago." The way he said it made it clear he didn't wish to elaborate. Vivian nodded, respecting his privacy. "Well, I'm grateful our paths crossed when they did." Roy smiled, the guardedness receding. "So am I. Get some rest, Vivian. Tomorrow we can talk about how to deal with your cousins and get you back your property." The next day dawned clear and cool, a perfect Wyoming autumn morning. Vivian came downstairs to find Roy already at breakfast, deep in conversation with Mrs. Sullivan. They both looked up as she entered. "Good morning," Mrs. Sullivan greeted her cheerfully. "Sit down, dear, you need a proper meal to regain your strength." As Vivian took a seat, Roy pushed a cup of coffee toward her. "We've been discussing your situation," he said. "Mrs. Sullivan knows quite a bit about property law, being married to the sheriff for 20 years. Jacob had to settle many a land dispute," Mrs. Sullivan explained, placing a plate of eggs and bacon before Vivian. "Now, tell me about this deed your father left you." Between bites of the hearty breakfast, Vivian explained. "My father's last letter said he'd filed a new deed with the county clerk, naming me as his sole heir. The copy he sent me is what my cousins found when they searched my things after I arrived. That's when they locked me in the barn." Mrs. Sullivan frowned. "Those boys never did respect the law, but if Henry filed it properly, it's legal and binding. We just need to get a copy from the county seat." "Which is a 2-day ride from here," Roy added. "I was thinking of going there myself, but you don't want to leave Vivian unprotected," Mrs. Sullivan finished for him. "No need. My nephew works as a clerk there. I can send a telegram today asking him to bring a copy when he visits this weekend." Vivian's face lit up with hope. "That would be wonderful, but what about until then? My cousins could come to town looking for me." "Let them come," Mrs. Sullivan said firmly, patting the pocket of her apron where, to Vivian's surprise, the outline of a small derringer was visible. "This house has never been successfully invaded, not even during the worst of the mining disputes 10 years back." Roy grinned. "I'm starting to see why the Parker boys give this place a wide berth." After breakfast, Roy suggested they walk into town to send the telegram and to let people see Vivian. "Best to be public about what happened," he advised. "Your cousins will think twice about trying anything if the whole town knows what they did." Vivian agreed, though she felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of facing the townsfolk. She had been gone for years, and small towns had long memories and complicated loyalties. They walked side by side down Sweetwater's Main Street, Roy shortening his stride to match hers. Despite her still recovering strength, Vivian held her head high. She wore one of Mrs. Sullivan's dresses, hastily altered to fit her smaller frame, and though it wasn't fashionable, it was clean and respectable. People stopped to stare as they passed. Some nodded in greeting, while others whispered behind their hands. Outside the general store, they encountered the first open hostility. "Well, look who's back, Henry Parker's high and mighty daughter," drawled a man lounging against a hitching post. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed deliberately close to Vivian's skirts. "Heard you had a disagreement with your kin." Roy's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Vivian placed a restraining touch on his arm. "Mr. Dawson," she acknowledged calmly. "Yes, my cousins and I have different interpretations of my father's will. I'm sure the law will sort it out." The man sneered. "Law around here tends to favor those who have put down roots, not fancy Eastern ladies who run off at the first opportunity." Before Roy could intervene, another voice joined the conversation. "That's enough, Earl." A middle-aged woman emerged from the store, her arms full of packages. "Vivian Parker left to get an education, as her father wished. There's no shame in that." The woman turned to Vivian with a kind smile. "I don't know if you remember me, dear. I'm Martha Wilson. Your mother and I were friends. I was so sorry to hear about Henry's passing." Vivian's face softened with recognition. "Mrs. Wilson, of course I remember you. You used to bring apple pies when my mother was ill." Martha nodded, her eyes sad. "I've been meaning to call on you since I heard you were back, but then there was all this business with your cousins." She glanced meaningfully at Vivian's bandaged wrists, visible beneath her sleeve cuffs. "Is it true what they're saying?" "That Jeb and the others locked you up?" Vivian hesitated, aware that the growing crowd of onlookers was waiting for her answer. Roy stood protectively at her side, his presence giving her courage. "Yes," she said clearly. "They chained me in the barn for 3 days without proper food or water, all because I showed them the deed my father filed making me his heir." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Earl Dawson pushed away from the hitching post, his face darkening. "The Parkers have been working that land alongside Henry for years. You can't just waltz back and take it." "The law says she can, if Henry Parker made her his legal heir." Roy interjected, his voice level but carrying an undercurrent of steel. And no grievance justifies chaining a woman in a barn to die. More murmurs, these of agreement. Martha Wilson stepped closer to Vivian. Well, I for one am glad to see you back where you belong, dear. Your father was so proud of you. Always talking about how his daughter was getting educated and would come back to make something of the ranch. The support from her mother's old friend brought tears to Vivian's eyes. Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. That means a great deal to me. They continued to the telegraph office where Mrs. Sullivan's message was sent to her nephew. On their way back to the boarding house, they passed the saloon just as the doors swung open and a familiar figure emerged. Jeb Parker froze when he saw Vivian and Roy. Two of his brothers followed him out, equally surprised by the encounter. The street went quiet, townsfolk stopping to watch the confrontation. Roy moved slightly in front of Vivian, his stance casual but ready. Didn't expect to see you in town so soon, cousin, Jeb said, his eyes narrowing. Thought you'd be halfway to Boston by now. This is my home, Jeb, Vivian replied steadily. I'm not going anywhere. Jeb's younger brother, Tom, stepped forward aggressively. You've got no right, she has every right, Roy cut in, and soon she'll have the documents to prove it. Jeb assessed Roy coldly. You're still sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, I see. Might want to reconsider that, stranger. People who cross the Parkers tend to regret it. Is that a threat? Roy asked, his hand moving casually to rest on his holstered revolver. The middle Parker brother, Luke, tugged at Jeb's arm. Come on, Jeb, not here, too many witnesses. Jeb glared at Vivian. This isn't over, cousin. That ranch belongs to those who worked it, not some city girl who thinks she can claim it with a piece of paper. The law will decide, Vivian said firmly. With a final threatening look, Jeb allowed his brothers to pull him back into the saloon. As the doors swung shut behind them, the street gradually returned to its normal bustle, though many glances were cast toward Vivian and Roy. You handled that well, Roy said quietly as they resumed walking. Vivian realized she was trembling slightly. I was terrified, she admitted. Jeb has always had a violent temper even when we were children, but I won't let him intimidate me out of what's rightfully mine. Roy smiled down at her with newfound respect. I believe you won't. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Roy and Vivian spent their mornings at the boarding house, going through her father's papers that she had managed to save before her cousins found her. In the afternoons, they would walk through town, gradually rebuilding Vivian's connections to the community. Roy discovered that she had a sharp mind for business and a clear vision for what she wanted to do with the ranch. My father always believed cattle was the future of this region, she explained as they sat on the boarding house porch one evening. But the market is changing. I studied agricultural management in Boston. I think we could diversify, keep cattle, but also grow crops that will ship well to the eastern markets. Roy listened attentively, asking questions that showed his own experience with ranching. As the days passed, he found himself increasingly drawn to this brave, intelligent woman who had survived her cousin's cruelty with her spirit intact. For her part, Vivian was growing to depend on Roy's steady presence and practical advice. He never treated her as fragile or incapable, despite having first met her in such a vulnerable state. Instead, he respected her opinions and supported her plans. One evening, after dinner at the boarding house, they sat alone in the small parlor. Mrs. Sullivan had tactfully retired early, leaving them with a pot of coffee and a plate of cookies. Tell me about Boston, Roy said, leaning back in his chair. Was it everything you hoped it would be? Vivian considered the question. It was exciting at first, the theaters, the libraries, the lectures, but I always knew I would come back. This is where I belong. She looked at him curiously. What about you? Have you ever found a place that felt like home since the war? Roy's eyes grew distant. Not really. After what I saw during those 4 years, it was hard to settle anywhere, easier to keep moving. He gave a self-deprecating smile. Sounds pitiful when I say it out loud. Not at all, Vivian said softly. I think many men came back from the war feeling that way. They fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional pop from the fireplace. Outside, a light rain began to fall, drumming gently on the roof. Roy, Vivian said finally, What will you do after the sheriff returns? Will you still go to Cheyenne? The question had been hovering between them, unspoken until now. Roy stared into his coffee cup as if seeking an answer there. I don't know, he admitted. That job in Cheyenne, it's a good opportunity. Steady work, decent pay. He looked up, meeting her eyes. But I find myself less eager to get there than I was a week ago. The implication hung in the air between them. Vivian felt her heart beat faster but couldn't find the words to respond. The moment was interrupted by a loud knock at the front door. Mrs. Sullivan's heavy footsteps came down the stairs, and they heard her open the door, followed by muffled conversation. A moment later, she appeared in the parlor doorway, her face grave. It's Sheriff Donovan. He's back early from the county seat and wants to speak with both of you. The sheriff was a tall, lean man with a graying mustache and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be easily fooled. He removed his hat as he entered the parlor, nodding to Vivian and assessing Roy with a professional gaze. Miss Parker, he said, I've heard some disturbing reports about your cousin's behavior. Mrs. Sullivan has filled me in on the basics, but I'd like to hear your account directly. Vivian recounted her ordeal, keeping her voice steady despite the painful memories. The sheriff's expression darkened as she described being chained in the barn. And you, Mr. Thornton, the sheriff said when she finished. You're the one who found her, Roy nodded, explaining how he had come across the situation and helped Vivian escape. Sheriff Donovan considered this information, tugging thoughtfully at his mustache. I've known the Parker boys all their lives, always been trouble, but this goes beyond mischief. This is criminal assault. He turned back to Vivian. You say your father left you the ranch legally? Yes. He filed a new deed with the county clerk last year, shortly before his death. Mrs. Sullivan's nephew is bringing a copy this weekend. The sheriff nodded. That would settle the ownership question legally, but I'm more concerned about your safety in the meantime. Those boys won't take this lying down. I've been staying close, Roy said, making sure they don't try anything in town. That's well and good, Mr. Thornton, but I can't have private citizens taking the law into their own hands, no matter how well-intentioned. The sheriff stood. I'll ride out to the Parker place tomorrow, place Jeb and the others under arrest for assault. Once they're in my jail, you'll be safer. Vivian exchanged a worried glance with Roy. Sheriff, my cousins have friends in the area. Even with them locked up, I'm not sure it's safe for me to return to the ranch alone. The sheriff frowned. That's a valid concern. I can't spare a deputy to guard you full time. He looked at Roy speculatively. How long were you planning to stay in Sweetwater, Mr. Thornton? Roy met Vivian's eyes briefly before answering. I reckon my business in Cheyenne can wait a while longer. The sheriff nodded, apparently satisfied. Very well. I'll deal with your cousins, Miss Parker. In the meantime, I suggest you stay here where it's safe. Once we have the deed copy and your cousins are facing charges, we can discuss your return to the ranch. After the sheriff left, Roy and Vivian remained in the parlor, the atmosphere between them charged with unspoken thoughts. You didn't have to say that, Vivian said quietly. About staying longer, I know you have obligations in Cheyenne. Roy moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. The job will wait, or if it doesn't, there will be others. He hesitated, then reached out to take her hand. Vivian, I've been drifting for years, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, but these past few days with you, they've meant something to me. Vivian's heart pounded as she looked into his earnest blue eyes. They've meant something to me too, she whispered. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, she met him halfway, their lips coming together in a gentle, questioning kiss that quickly deepened with shared emotion. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Roy rested his forehead against hers. I know it's fast, he murmured. We've only known each other a week, but I haven't felt this way about anyone in a very long time. Vivian smiled, her eyes shining with happy tears. Sometimes the heart knows what it wants, even when the head thinks it's being impulsive. They might have kissed again, but Mrs. Sullivan's deliberate footsteps in the hallway made them move apart, both blushing like teenagers caught behind the schoolhouse. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Sheriff Donovan arrived at the boarding house just after breakfast, his expression grim. The Parker boys are gone, he announced without preamble. Packed up and left sometime in the night. Took horses, supplies, weapons. Looks like they're planning to be gone a while. Vivian gasped. Gone. But where would they go? Hard to say. They have family up in Montana Territory, might be heading that way. The sheriff looked troubled. What concerns me is what they did before they left. The ranch house has been ransacked, and they set fire to the barn. Oh no, Vivian whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. My deputies and some neighbors managed to put it out before it spread to the other buildings, but the barn's mostly gone, and there's something else. He hesitated, clearly reluctant to continue. What is it? Roy asked, his hand finding Vivian's in support. They left a note. The sheriff pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. It's addressed to you, Miss Parker. Vivian took it with trembling fingers and read aloud. Cousin Vivian, if we can't have what's rightfully ours, you won't either. By the time you read this, we'll be long gone, but we've made sure you'll remember us every time you look at that ranch. Good luck rebuilding with no money and no help. Jeb, Roy's jaw tightened. What else did they do? The sheriff sighed heavily. They slaughtered most of the cattle. About 50 head, left to rot in the south pasture. Only spared the horses because they couldn't take them all and didn't have time to kill them too, I reckon. Vivian sank into a chair, the paper falling from her numb fingers. All her plans, her dreams of revitalizing her father's ranch, how could she do that now, with no cattle and a burned barn? Roy knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. Vivian, look at me. When she raised devastated eyes to his, he continued firmly, this is a setback, not the end. The land is still there, the house is standing, you can rebuild. With what? She asked brokenly. My savings went into the journey here and settling my father's outstanding debts. I don't have enough to restock the herd. I may have a solution, Roy said slowly. That job in Cheyenne, my friend Marcus owns one of the biggest spreads in the territory. He's a good man, fair. If I explain the situation, he might be willing to sell you some cattle on credit or even enter into a partnership. Hope flickered in Vivian's eyes. You do that. I'd do a lot more than that for you, Roy said softly, forgetting for a moment that the sheriff was still in the room. Sheriff Donovan cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, I'll leave you folks to discuss your plans. I've put out the word about the Parker boys. If they show their faces anywhere in the territory, they'll be arrested. He headed for the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Miss Parker, your father would be proud of how you're handling this. He always said you had his grit and your mother's grace. After he left, Vivian sat quietly for a long moment, processing everything. Then, with a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders. I want to see it, she said firmly. The ranch. I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with. Roy nodded, understanding her need to face the damage head-on. I'll ask Mrs. Sullivan if we can borrow her wagon. 2 hours later, they crested the low hill that overlooked the Parker ranch. From this distance, it looked peaceful, a modest 2-story house with a stone chimney, several outbuildings, and rolling pastures stretching toward distant mountains. Only the blackened skeleton of the barn revealed that something was wrong. As they drove closer, the smell of smoke still hung in the air, mingling with another, more sickening odor from the south pasture where the slaughtered cattle lay. Vivian's face was pale but determined as Roy helped her down from the wagon. The house first, she said. I need to see what they've done inside. The interior was a mess of broken furniture and scattered possessions, but the structure itself was sound. Vivian moved from room to room, taking inventory of the damage. In what had been her father's study, she knelt to gather papers strewn across the floor. They were looking for something, she murmured, sorting through the documents. Probably the original deed. Roy helped her collect the papers, noticing how she handled each one carefully, regardless of its apparent value. Did they find it? I don't think so. My father was cautious with important documents. She moved to a seemingly solid section of wall paneling and pressed a hidden catch. A small compartment opened, revealing a metal box. He showed me this hiding place when I was 12, made me promise never to tell anyone else. She took out the box and opened it with a small key she wore on a chain around her neck. Inside were several legal documents, including what appeared to be the original deed naming Vivian as heir to the property. He always was a careful man, Roy said with admiration. Vivian smiled sadly. He had to be. The Parkers have always had a reputation for taking what they want. She carefully replaced the documents in the box. Let's see the rest of the property. They spent the next 2 hours assessing the damage. The barn was a total loss, though some of the tools stored in a shed had survived. The cattle destruction was even worse up close, nearly the entire herd slaughtered out of pure spite. Standing in the yard, surveying the devastation, Vivian should have felt defeated. Instead, she felt a growing determination. "They thought this would break me," she said quietly. "Make me give up and leave, but this is my home and I won't be driven from it." Roy watched her with growing admiration. "What do you want to do first?" She turned to him, her blue eyes clear and focused. "First we clean up, then we rebuild the barn. I'll need somewhere to house the new cattle. If your friend in Cheyenne is willing to help, I can offer him a partnership. This land can support twice the herd my father maintained if it's managed properly." Roy smiled, seeing not the battered woman he'd rescued from chains, but a strong, capable rancher with vision and determination. "I like the way you think, Vivian Parker." They drove back to town as the sun was setting, having made a list of immediate needs and longer-term plans. At the boarding house, Mrs. Sullivan had dinner waiting and news to share. "The whole town's talking about what those Parker boys did," she said as they ate, "and folks are taking sides." "Against me?" Vivian asked, prepared for the worst. "Some," Mrs. Sullivan admitted. "Earl Dawson and his cronies are saying the ranch should have gone to Jeb and the others, that you abandoned your claim when you went east. But they're the minority. Most people are outraged, especially after hearing how they treated you." She leaned forward with a conspiratorial smile. "In fact, Martha Wilson has organized a work party for this weekend. Half the town is planning to come out and help clear the debris from the barn. The lumber mill is donating materials for a new one." Vivian's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say. I never expected such kindness." "That's Sweetwater for you," Mrs. Sullivan said proudly. "We take care of our own, and Henry Parker was well respected. People are happy to help his daughter." Later that evening, Roy and Vivian sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the clear Wyoming sky. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him. "I'll leave for Cheyenne tomorrow," he said. "Should take me 3 days to get there, a day or two to talk with Marcus, and 3 days back. A week, maybe a bit more." Vivian nodded, trying not to show her anxiety at the thought of his departure. "I'll be fine. Mrs. Sullivan has promised to stay at the ranch with me once we've cleared enough space to make it habitable again. And with the town's help, we should have the barn raising well underway by the time you return." Roy tilted her chin up to look into her eyes. "Are you sure? I don't like leaving you so soon after what happened." "I'm sure," she said firmly. "This is important for the ranch's future, and—" She hesitated, then continued softly, "and for our future, if that's what you want." Roy's expression softened. "It is what I want, Vivian. I know it's fast, but when you've spent as many years as I have searching for something that feels right, you learn to recognize it when you find it." He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and growing affection. When they separated, both were smiling. "1 week," he said, "and then we'll start building something together." True to her word, Vivian dove into the work of reclaiming her ranch. The morning after Roy left for Cheyenne, she moved back into her childhood home, Mrs. Sullivan accompanying her as promised. Together with a few volunteers from town, they cleaned the house from top to bottom, repaired broken furniture, and made the place livable again. Word spread quickly about the planned barn raising that weekend. By Saturday morning, over 30 people had gathered at the Parker Ranch, bringing tools, food, and willing hands. Men started clearing the burned remains of the old barn, while women set up long tables for a communal meal. Martha Wilson found Vivian directing a group of workers. "Your mother would be so proud to see this," she said, linking her arm through Vivian's. The whole community coming together to help her daughter. Vivian smiled, watching the activity around her. "I still can't believe how many people came." "Don't underestimate the power of a good story," Martha replied with a wink. "Handsome cowboy rescues beautiful rancher from evil cousins. It's better than a dime novel. Half the unmarried women in town are hoping he doesn't come back so they can console you." Vivian laughed, a carefree sound she hadn't made in weeks. "They'll be disappointed then. Roy promised to return and he strikes me as a man of his word. So it's like that, is it? Martha asked with a knowing smile. Well, I can't say I'm surprised, the way he looked at you in town. A woman recognizes these things. The work continued through the day and into Sunday. By Sunday evening, the foundation for the new barn was laid, and the framework was beginning to take shape. The community effort had accomplished in 2 days what would have taken weeks for Vivian to do alone. As people began packing up to return to town, Sheriff Donovan rode in with news. Got a telegram from the sheriff in Rock Springs, he announced. The Parker boys were spotted there yesterday trying to sell some horses. They got away before they could be arrested, but they're heading west, not north to Montana as I'd guessed. What does that mean for Vivian? Mrs. Sullivan asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. It means they're running, not plotting revenge, the sheriff said confidently. My guess is they'll keep going, maybe all the way to California. They know they'll face serious charges if they come back. Vivian nodded, relief washing over her. One less worry as she rebuilt her life. The days passed in a blur of activity. Vivian threw herself into the work of restoration, from sunup to sundown. She helped with the barn construction, mended fences, and took inventory of what livestock remained, mostly horses, and a few milk cows that had been kept in a separate pasture. At night, exhausted but satisfied, she would sit on the porch with Mrs. Sullivan, looking at the stars and wondering where Roy was, if he had reached Cheyenne, if his friend would be willing to help. 5 days after Roy's departure, a rider approached the ranch in the late afternoon. Vivian's heart leaped, thinking it might be Roy returning early, but it was a young man she didn't recognize. Miss Parker, he called, reining in his horse. Telegram for you from Cheyenne. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the paper from him. It was brief. Arriving tomorrow with Marcus. Stop. He wants to see ranch before discussing terms. Stop. Bring good news. Stop. Miss you. Stop. Roy. Vivian pressed the telegram to her chest, a smile spreading across her face. He was coming back and bringing help with him. The next day, Vivian was up at dawn, too excited and nervous to sleep. She wore her best dress, one of the few that had survived her cousin's ransacking, and fussed with her hair until Mrs. Sullivan laughed and told her to stop before she wore it out. He's seen you at your worst, chained in a barn, the older woman reminded her. I doubt he'll turn around and leave if your hair isn't perfect. Around noon, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Vivian stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the bright Wyoming sun. 3 riders were approaching Roy in the lead, followed by 2 men she didn't recognize. Roy's face lit up when he saw her waiting. He dismounted quickly and strode toward the porch, removing his hat as he climbed the steps. Vivian, he said, his voice warm with emotion. You look wonderful. Before she could reply, he had pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of just how much he had missed her. Vivian returned the kiss eagerly, forgetting for a moment that they had an audience. A discreet cough from behind them finally caused them to separate, both slightly flushed. Roy turned to introduce his companions, who had dismounted and were waiting politely at the bottom of the steps. Vivian, this is Marcus Reed, my friend from the war and the man I told you about. He indicated a tall, broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. And this is Daniel Frost, Marcus's head cattle buyer. Marcus stepped forward, extending his hand. Miss Parker, Roy has told me a great deal about you and your situation. I'm very pleased to meet you. Vivian shook his hand firmly. Thank you for coming all this way, Mr. Reed. Please come inside where it's cool. Mrs. Sullivan has prepared refreshments. Over lemonade and Mrs. Sullivan's famous apple cake, they discussed business. Marcus was direct but fair, asking pointed questions about the ranch's water rights, grazing capacity, and Vivian's long-term plans. Roy tells me you studied agricultural management in Boston, he said, clearly impressed. That's unusual for a young woman. My father believed education was important regardless of gender, Vivian replied, and he always intended for me to take over the ranch someday. Marcus nodded approvingly. A forward-thinking man. Now, I've discussed several possibilities with Roy. The simplest would be for me to sell you cattle on credit, but given the extent of what you're rebuilding, I think a partnership might serve us both better. He outlined his proposal. He would provide a starter herd of 200 head, plus breeding bulls. In return, he would receive 20% of the profits for the first 5 years, after which Vivian could buy out his share if she wished. "It's a fair offer," Roy said quietly. "Better than I expected, actually." Vivian considered it carefully. "What about management? Would you want a say in how the ranch is run?" "Day-to-day operations would be entirely your decision," Marcus assured her. "I'd only expect consultation on major changes that might affect profitability, and of course, regular reports on the herd's condition." "That seems reasonable," Vivian agreed. "When could the cattle be delivered?" Daniel Frost spoke up for the first time. "We could have the first 100 head here within 2 weeks. The rest would follow a month later to give you time to prepare." Vivian extended her hand to Marcus. "Mr. Reed, I believe we have an agreement." As they shook hands, Roy watched with pride. In the short time he'd known her, Vivian had transformed from a victim to a confident businesswoman, taking control of her destiny. After the business discussion concluded, Marcus and Daniel rode into town to secure rooms at the hotel, leaving Roy and Vivian alone for the first time since his return. "I can't believe you convinced him to come all this way," Vivian said as they walked around the property, showing him the progress on the barn. Roy shrugged modestly. "Marcus has been looking to expand his operations eastward for a while. When I told him about your situation and your education, he was intrigued. After meeting you, I'm sure he's convinced he's made a sound investment." Vivian stopped walking and turned to face him. "And what about you, Roy Thornton? What convinced you to come back?" He took both her hands in his. "Do you really need to ask? Vivian, in all my years of wandering, I've never met anyone like you. Your courage, your determination, your kindness." He paused, suddenly looking uncertain. "I know it's been less than 2 weeks since we met. If you think it's too soon to talk about a future together, I understand." Vivian stepped closer to him, her eyes shining. "It is soon," she agreed. "By any conventional standard, we barely know each other, but I think when something is right, you feel it here." She placed a hand over her heart. "And this feels right, Roy." He smiled, relief and joy washing over his features. "It does, doesn't it?" He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I don't have much to offer you, Vivian. No land, no fortune. Just my hands, my heart, and a promise to stand by you through whatever comes." "That's all I need," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. The barn was completed, fences repaired, and pastures prepared for the arrival of the new herd. Roy proved invaluable, his years of experience with cattle drives and ranch work complementing Vivian's theoretical knowledge. Together, they made a formidable team. When the first 100 cattle arrived, driven by Marcus's cowboys, they worked side by side to settle the animals into their new home. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Roy took Vivian's hand. "I've been thinking," he said, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "About the future, our future." Vivian smiled. "What about it?" "Well, I've been staying in the bunkhouse with the hands Marcus sent to help with the herd. It's practical, but—" He hesitated, uncharacteristically nervous. "Vivian, I want to do this right. I want to court you properly, ask for your hand the way a gentleman should." Her heart swelled with emotion. "Roy Thornton, are you saying you want to marry me?" "I am," he confirmed, his blue eyes serious. "I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Vivian Parker. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of happiness sprang to her eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." Roy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. From it, he extracted a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the last rays of the setting sun. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "The only thing of value I've carried with me all these years." "It's beautiful," Vivian whispered, admiring how it looked on her hand, "and it means so much more knowing it was hers." They were married 3 weeks later in Sweetwater's small church, with seemingly the entire town in attendance. Martha Wilson stood up for Vivian, while Marcus Reed served as Roy's best man. Sheriff Donovan gave the bride away, stepping in for her late father, Mrs. Sullivan outdid herself organizing the reception, which was held on the ranch under a canopy of trees strung with lanterns. Musicians played while couples danced on a wooden platform constructed for the occasion. As Roy led Vivian in their first dance as husband and wife, he marveled at how much his life had changed in just 2 months. "What are you thinking?" Vivian asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "I'm thinking about that day I found you in the barn," he replied. "How close I came to riding past without investigating, how different both our lives would be if I had." She rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I believe we were meant to find each other, Roy. Out of all the paths we might have taken, ours crossed at exactly the right moment." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "I think you're right, Mrs. Thornton." She smiled at her new name. "Mrs. Thornton," she repeated. "I like the sound of that." As the evening wore on, guests began to depart, offering final congratulations to the newlyweds. Marcus Reed was among the last to leave. "I'm heading back to Cheyenne tomorrow," he told them, "but I'll be back in a month to check on my investment." He clapped Roy on the shoulder. "You've got yourself a fine partner, both in business and in life." After everyone had gone, Roy swept Vivian into his arms and carried her across the threshold of the house that was now truly their home. In the master bedroom, freshly renovated and decorated with wildflowers for the occasion, he set her gently on her feet. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thornton," he said softly. Vivian wound her arms around his neck, drawing him down for a kiss. "Our home," she corrected. "Built on land that has been in my family for generations, but made new because we're creating it together." Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Vivian nestled against Roy's side, his arm holding her close. Outside, the Wyoming night was filled with the sounds of their ranch cattle lowing in the distance, the soft nickering of horses in the new barn, the rustle of prairie grass in the gentle breeze. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Vivian asked sleepily. "If my cousins hadn't chained me in that barn." Roy's arm tightened around her. "I try not to dwell on it. What they did was cruel beyond words, but in a strange way, I'm grateful. Without their cruelty, I might never have found the greatest treasure of my life." She smiled in the darkness. "From chains to this," she murmured. "Sometimes the darkest moments lead us to the brightest light." Roy kissed her forehead tenderly. "And I promise to spend the rest of my days making sure you never see darkness like that again." 5 years later, the Parker Thornton Ranch had prospered beyond anyone's expectations. Under Vivian and Roy's joint management, the herd had grown to over 500 head, with a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far away as Chicago. The original partnership with Marcus Reed had been so successful that they had expanded it to include joint ventures in breeding operations, and even a small meat packing facility in Cheyenne. On a warm summer evening, Vivian sat on the wide porch of their expanded home, watching their 3-year-old son Henry playing with his wooden horses in the yard. Roy had built him a miniature corral, and the boy was serious about making sure each of his toy animals was properly placed. The sound of hoof beats announced Roy's return from checking the north pasture. Henry abandoned his toys and ran to meet his father, squealing with delight as Roy swung down from his horse and scooped the boy into his arms. "Papa, did you see the new calves? Are they big yet?" Henry fired questions with the endless curiosity of a 3-year-old as Roy carried him toward the house. "Not yet, partner. Calves take time to grow, just like little boys," Roy replied patiently, tousling his son's dark hair so like his mother's. Vivian rose to greet them, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Their second child was due in less than 2 months, and Roy had become increasingly protective, insisting she rest more and work less. "How are my 2 favorite people?" Roy asked, kissing Vivian gently before setting Henry down to resume his play. "We're fine," Vivian assured him, taking his hand and placing it where their unborn daughter was kicking vigorously. "Though your daughter seems determined to become a dancer rather than a rancher." Roy's face lit up as he felt the movement beneath his palm. "Strong, just like her mother," he said proudly. They settled on the porch swing, Roy's arm around Vivian's shoulders, watching their son play as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. I had a letter from Martha Wilson today, Vivian said. She says there's a rumor that Jeb Parker was seen in Denver last month. Roy's expression turned serious. Does that worry you? Vivian considered the question. No, she said finally. It's been 5 years. Whatever anger drove him and my other cousins to do what they did. I hope time has softened it, and if not, we're stronger now. This ranch, our family, what we've built together, it's too solid to be threatened by ghosts from the past. Roy nodded, pressing a kiss to her temple. You're right. And if he or any of them ever did come back, they'd find a very different Vivian Parker than the one they chained in that barn. Thornton, she corrected with a smile. Vivian Thornton. Parker is just the name on the deed. As if on cue, Henry ran up to the porch, holding out his arms to be lifted onto his mother's lap, or what remained of it with her pregnant belly. Roy helped him up, making sure he was careful of his mother's condition. Story, Mama. The boy asked hopefully, his blue eyes so like his father's, wide and pleading. Which one would you like to hear? Vivian asked, though she already knew the answer. It was always the same request at bedtime. The Cowboy story, Henry declared, where Papa saves Mama. Roy and Vivian exchanged smiles over their son's head. They had created a child-friendly version of their meeting, one that emphasized rescue and heroism without the frightening details of Vivian's captivity. Once upon a time, Vivian began, her voice soft with love for her son and the man beside her. A brave cowboy was riding across the prairie when he heard someone calling for help. As she told their story, the sun sank lower in the Wyoming sky, painting the ranch in golden light. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. Horses nickered in the barn that had risen from ashes, and a family built from the unlikeliest of beginnings sat together on their porch, bound by love that had been forged in adversity and strengthened by years of partnership. Roy listened to his wife's voice, watching his son's rapt expression, feeling his unborn daughter's movements, and knew with absolute certainty that all his years of wandering had led him exactly where he was meant to be. From the moment he had broken those chains and carried Vivian into the sunlight, their paths had been intertwined, leading them here to home, to family, to a love that had transformed them both. In the gathering twilight, with the first stars appearing in the vast Wyoming sky, Roy Thornton silently thanked whatever fate or providence had guided him to that barn on that fateful day. For in saving Vivian, he had ultimately saved himself, finding purpose, belonging, and a love that would last a lifetime.